Today we're talking about Chevy trucks, and they are all about utility. And you know how they say this isn't your grandpa's pickup truck? Well, it turns out this is mine. This is a 1954 Chevy pickup, and it's got some great features. It's got a 6-cylinder engine, enough seat for a driver and passenger, and it's got a bed, which is everything you'd expect from a pickup truck. But we're here to talk about something newer. So let's move on to something a little bit farther ahead. Let's move forward about 40 years, because it turns out this is also my grandfather's old pickup, but this one is now mine. This being a 1994 Chevy 2500, and it has some even better features. We're talking about a small block V8, a whole new extra gear in a 4-speed transmission, and as you can see, this one has a cargo accessory to make it a little bit more functional for your everyday use. But this isn't all we're here to talk about, because the latest and greatest from Chevrolet is this, the 2024 Chevy Silverado EV RST. And as far as I'm concerned, this is, I think, Chevy's most capable pickup truck ever. But let's take a closer look and see if you agree with me or if this is just some other EV truck. Starting up front, you'll see this is a clear new iteration that's a pretty extreme departure from generations past, although that's what we would expect generationally. What you might not expect is how different this is from the standard Silverado you find on the lot today. Next to any 2024 or 2025, this still looks like a very different truck. And a lot of that has to do with how tall it is. Now, not to say that Chevy trucks don't have big, tall hoods, because like most trucks these days, they do. But they usually don't come so far down and have so much body to them. A lot of that has to do with the aerodynamic shape of this vehicle, because while this has an enormous battery, it is still designed to go farther with whatever power is on board. When it comes to the actual lights, although obviously all these are LEDs, you'll notice it's going to be in a completely different spot. And this is the divorce headlight look that I think is done pretty well here, although I don't mind having one larger module that houses everything. In this case, I do think that this light is pretty understated and kind of just hidden in here. The other thing you can hide up front is your cargo, because this is an electric truck, and obviously we'll touch on cargo a little bit later, but every other Silverado on the lot doesn't do this. And the fact that it's automatic makes it that much easier, but again, this is the new age of Silverado. As far as I'm concerned, General Motors went with a whole milk approach to their electric trucks, and my only word of caution with this is make sure it'll fit in your everyday parking spot, because at 233 inches long, this is going to be one of the larger trucks you can buy on the market, especially compared to the rest of the electric vehicles, electric trucks that we have available. I'd also make sure you're parking it on a pretty solid foundation, because those 8-lug wheels are indicative of the nearly 9,000-pound curb weight that we get with something like this, so a loose foundation is not where I would leave your truck. It's also wide and tall, and actually parked right next to my Tesla Model 3, these windows start where the top of my Model 3 ends, and that's not the only strange car comparison. See this wheelbase? Well, it is longer than an entire Fiat 500e. And while that might be the smallest car on the market today, that still seems like a pretty extreme stat to me. Now, the only thing I really am disappointed with this truck and its dimensions happens to be at the very middle there, where we have the clear indication that this is a unibody truck. That's not something that bothers me. The fact is that Chevy has done a unibody truck before, and it had that same sort of aesthetic, and it was called the Chevy Avalanche. And the fact that the blue electric E that we have in the middle of the Silverado is not placed at the end of an Avalanche badge feels like a missed opportunity to me. Big, large, and in charge is going to be a recurring theme, but I think it's pretty clear why. And under this large wheel arch, we find a relatively sized wheel and tire package. Here on the RST, we're getting a 24-inch 8-lug wheel, which means I hope you like this design. I don't think there are going to be a whole lot of aftermarket options available, at least right away. This is still a truck, and the fact that we get this much tire just tells you how much space we have here under that wheel arch, but I want to make sure I have rubber, because I expect my truck to do truck things. And even though this isn't the trim I would take for an off-road adventure, the fact that it has an air suspension means that I do get a little bit more ground clearance should I find myself a little bit farther off the beaten path. GM is a little bit cagey when it comes to how much battery is on board their vehicles, but there are a few things we know for sure. First of all is that there's a lot of it, and we can see that visually, because from this point down, we have not a single stack, but a double stack of batteries, which is definitely not what you find on most other electric vehicles out there. We also know that that battery on board will get this vehicle an estimated 440 miles of driving range, which is a pretty significant number, especially for how large this vehicle is. Although The size of it is what allows the batteries to be on board. I digress. The point is that you can take this quite a ways without having to recharge. And when you do have to recharge, that happens pretty quickly also. Now, good news for folks who want to use that Tesla supercharger network that Chevy is now able to access. The charge port is on the back left, which matches all the other Tesla vehicles, which is what those superchargers were designed for. But you won't be able to max out the charging speed because on the road you can get 350 kilowatts of charging, which will get you on the low battery end a 100-mile charge in as low as 10 minutes. You will need to find a 350 kilowatt station to be able to do that, and right now that is not those superchargers. If you're at home, you are also going to be able to charge this quicker than most, at least as far as the total power coming in, but because it's not the most efficient vehicle out there, that's not always going to be the exact same equation. That said, 19.2 kilowatts is what this can charge at a level 2 charger, but frankly, that's even more than I had at home. The other thing this battery provides us is access to power, because with more battery comes more power potential, and this vehicle in its dual motor trim, as we get here, is capable of 754 horsepower and 785 pound-feet of torque. And when I say capable, there is a wide open watts mode, which just conveniently spells wow, and that's where you go ahead and access that maximum power output. Up front, we've got a good view over the hood and a lot of adjustability. The steering wheel is going to be a powered tilt and telescopic adjustment, and your seat is going to be 8-way powered and 4-way lumbar, all connected with the 2-position memory system. That all said, I wasn't able to find a super comfortable position for myself. These seats are relatively supportive, but the one thing that was missing for me was leg support. And while I could go ahead and raise my seat a little bit higher to get a little bit of that lift and comfort there under my legs, I wish this seat could have tilted a little bit farther back. And for that reason, mostly for myself, I have to give this about a 7 when it comes to that seating. There is a lot of adjustability. I appreciate the amount of space that we get, again, especially vertically. I just wasn't able to get my ideal position, but I imagine for you, you should be able to find something probably a little bit more comfortable than I did. Here in the back, the theme of ample room definitely continues, because with this seat set for my driving position, I have almost a foot of extra room. And if I slide over here, you can see even just that much better. With this seat literally all the way back, I think it only cuts maybe an extra inch or so out of my total volume. The thing is, if I sit all the way vertical, like vertical, I would very gently brush my head on the ceiling. But if I tilt my head back, I'm starting to run into this mechanism that goes ahead and lowers that rear window. So if I was sitting in the back while I have tons of room out front, it does get a little bit squished when it comes to the headroom. But I do have plenty of room left and right. I also have a armrest with a couple cup holders here. I could also reach a couple of the cup holders up here. And for folks in the back, at least in this trim, we do get heated outboard seating, vents, and a storage cubby that's going to come just under our 2 USB-Cs and a standard 110 outlet. Around back, you should find everything you've come to expect from a top trim truck these days, including LED lighting, parking sensors, and camera views galore. That's your standard backup camera with a top-down view, so hitching up is a little bit easier, and 2 additional cameras for looking farther back if you do have a trailer, or directly into the bed, so whatever it is you're carrying with you, you should be able to keep a pretty good eye on it. If you are trailering, we have up to 10,000 pounds towing capacity and a pretty easy to access tow hitch there, and just to the left of the license plate is where you'll find your 7-pin connector. The trailering is a big part of why I think this is one of the most capable Chevy trucks ever built. Obviously, that's not going to be the highest capacity you have ever been able to achieve, but there's a few more tricks to this truck that make it, I think, the most capable. We'll start with one that we get on a lot of other Chevy trucks, which is this tailgate design. Now, one downside is that it's not a auto up and auto down, though you can release it from either the key fob or inside the truck. But it is a multi-step tailgate, because if you release the second piece of it, you get a step. And this step, I think, is the best in the business. And for folks who need that step, well, having it be easily accessible is certainly an important piece of that puzzle. But it's not just this, so let me go ahead and move the camera and we'll get into the rest of what makes this the most capable truck, at least in my opinion. With the soft cover rolled up out of the way, we can see a little bit more clearly about what's happening here in the bed. And the first thing we're going to do is extend that bed. So while this is not the best way to start it, all we have to do is lower the tailgate, lift this piece up, and we now have a longer than 6-foot bed, which is what the truck comes with. At here, we're just about 8 feet long, so your sheet goods should be able to fit here without issue. But I've now gone ahead and taken away my step. But the good news is they have built-in steps directly here on the side that are big enough for a large foot. I wear size 11 most of the time, and I can get up there pretty easily. And the next thing I want to show you is the power on board, because obviously this is an electric truck and it has a lot of power underneath, but also available to you. So down here, we have two 120 volt outlets, both of them being 20 amp. And just to the right of that, we have a 240 volt, 30 amp outlet. So if this is something you're going to take to a job site, potentially, obviously the work truck will be doing a little bit more of that, or going out to camping or tailgating, you should be able to power everything you need from this truck nice and easily. But if this isn't enough space for you, or you want to do something a little bit different, obviously the big party piece here is the Midgate. One of the more practical modes acts as a pass-through, and as you can see, it's a 60-40 split, meaning I can still have a passenger in this side and have a longer item extending into the cab. And on a lot of the rainy days we get here in Washington, if I had an 8-foot item that I wanted in here and covered up, all I'd have to do is unroll this soft cover and then use the cab essentially as a canopy. But if you want more space, all you have to do is lower this section, and you now have a essentially full width opening into the cab to get your longer items in here. The fun mode here is more of an open air experience, like you would find in something like a Toyota Tundra. And there aren't a lot of other vehicles that go ahead and lower, or in this case, remove that rear window. And if you want to fit the absolute most, go ahead and put this whole section down, and you've now got an enormous opening to fit, well, you tell me what you can fit in here, because I see a lot of potential. Moving to the interior, we'll start here on the seats, and we have both height adjustable shoulder rests and headrests, so you should be able to find a pretty comfortable position for yourself. We also have red piping along the outside of this seat that is in theme with the sport truck look, and this is the RST trim, so we would expect to see quite a bit of that. Now here in the door panel, we'll also see one of the only other splashes of color here in the interior, and that's going to be this red and blue stitching. That is going to be throughout the dashboard and here on the side of the truck. I wouldn't mind a little bit more of that, because otherwise things get pretty black. Now here on the dashboard is going to be even more black, but down here, a little bit difficult with the lighting, but you can see that we do get the red and blue carrying throughout there. The other splash of color we get is going to be here in the ventilation. So that's going to be just a glossy red stripe there in the middle. It's going to be a little bit of a different color than the red that we get both in the piping and the stitching. I wish that was maybe a little bit better lined up, but still there nonetheless. And then just below the dash, we don't have a dual glove box layout like we get in some trucks, but we do have a little shelf here that has a couple different compartments, easy enough to go ahead and drop a phone in. And if you do need to have a little bit more storage for yourself, we do have a pretty large glove box, pretty wide actually, maybe not the deepest or the tallest, but definitely wide. So you should be able to fit not only gloves, but an 11-inch tablet computer there without too much issue. The focal point of this cabin, however, is likely going to be this infotainment screen, and it's about 17 inches, and there is a lot of screen real estate. Lucky we do have a physical volume knob, and there's actually a screen inside and outside of this, so it's kind of built into that layout, and it's a nice look, although the only downside is if you're reaching over to use that knob, you might end up accidentally bumping the power on and power off, which I did more than once, unfortunately. Now, the rest of this screen, good news is that it's powered by Google. It's not going to have Android Auto or Apple CarPlay, but the Google operating system, Google Automotive, is going to be a pretty good one to use. You can see we have our Google Assistant, so you can say, "Hey G," and go ahead and activate that system. We also can download different apps from the Play Store, and all of these here on the main display are going to be adjustable. So if I want to go ahead and move my settings around, I can go ahead and reconfigure this layout to make it work for whatever my needs are at the moment. The only thing that is worth noting from here, besides how large it is actually going to be the way you utilize the climate control functions, because I have it off at the moment, but if I turn it on, the on-off button is actually going to be a physical button down here below. But if I want to change anything, like my temperature, or I want to go ahead and turn on, where the wind is actually blowing, the air is blowing, I can do that both from the screen and down here. So it really does come down to personal preference. The only thing you can't do down here that I find a little bit inconvenient is access the heating and cooled seating. That's going to be done here in the touchscreen. You do have the option of heating the seat and the back, or just the back. So a little bit of functionality there, but again, I do wish there was a button for that. Down below those controls, we get a fair amount of storage. Now, tucked into here is going to be your cell phone, and this is a pretty large slot that ultimately ends up being taken up almost completely by your cell phone. So I almost wish this was a little bit more shallow, or maybe a little bit more vertical, so that it wasn't so much wasted space, or there was more space that I could use for other storage. We also have two USB-C chargers there and a standard cigarette lighter outlet there. And then Just behind that, we have two pretty large cup holders. Now that's gonna be what you would expect in a pickup truck, and I was able to fit everything I wanted to in there. Behind that, just a little bit more storage, just a nice open cubby space. And then behind that, we do have our armrest, as you can see, Silverado First Edition with that stitching here. If I lift that up, we get quite a bit more storage. It is fairly deep, not as wide as we would get in the standard Chevy trucks, but still pretty good storage space, and one more USB-C charge plug right there. One of the best things about this big Google integrated system is that we can also get our Google Maps right here in front of us. And this one does have a heads-up display, as you can see there from that binnacle. And maybe you can see just a little bit of it on the windshield, but I can get my turn-by-turn directions directly in front of me in my line of sight. We also, on this 11-inch display, have the ability to go ahead and cycle through quite a few different visual modes. So if you want things to be very minimal, you can do that. If you want more information, if you want somewhat of a classic look, you can go ahead and do that. But on the left side is going to be your miles per hour. On the right side there is going to be how many kilowatts you're using or regenerating. So even though it looks like a mile per hour and tachometer, it is going to be doing something a little bit different. Moving out from there, we run into our steering wheel, which is going to be a pretty typical Chevy steering wheel. But that does mean we have some buttons behind the steering wheel, and those are worth noting. So this is going to be your regenerative brake paddle. That's going to increase the amount of regen you're able to get no matter what regen mode you're in. Below that, you're going to have an up and down switch for your track forward and track backward. And you'll find the same thing over here for volume up and down. And what that really does is means that we get a limited number of buttons here on the steering wheel. And honestly, I appreciate that because all my functions are here, but you don't have a very clustered system. On the left here is going to be mostly your adaptive cruise control, setting your follow distance, turning on Super Cruise. This is a Super Cruise enabled vehicle, and obviously turning those systems off. On the right-hand side is going to be your infotainment. So this is going to be switching that main display screen. You have your heated steering wheel, which is always a nice touch. Things like your voice-activated assistant and your music selection, picking your source. So everything you need is going to be here in the steering wheel. And as I mentioned, it's a Super Cruise steering wheel. So you do get that Super Cruise indicator there at the top. There aren't going to be too many controls up there in the ceiling, but that's mostly because we don't have a moonroof that needs to open, but we do in fact have an enormous sheet of glass above us. And I wish this did have some sort of shade or an electrochromatic function. I haven't been in a situation where it's gotten too hot, but it's been quite cold. And so I think in the summer months, that might be a little bit different. And I might prefer or look for something to go ahead and cool that down. Besides being very quick, this does a lot of other things, but it doesn't do everything. So one thing it is nice at doing is being a pretty comfortable ride. And where I live, there is quite a bit of broken pavement. So it's not always the most comfortable ride. And there are parts of my drive around town that I hit at the speed that you're allowed to go, not the speed it recommends, to see how these suspensions hold up. And honestly, this is one of the more comfortable suspensions that I've had here testing at home. That's great because this is a lot of truck to go ahead and manage. And it only takes a very abrupt instance for you to feel like this is getting jostled a little bit, because it does handle itself very well. That air suspension works very well. Now, I haven't done any fiddling for my daily driving with the ride height, so that is just standard ride height in normal driving mode, but I think that's what most people will spend their time in, and they'll find it pretty comfortable. So when it comes to ride, this is a very comfortable place to be, assuming you found a comfortable position here in the driver's seat, which unfortunately I didn't find quite the one I was looking for, but the vehicle itself has handled very nicely. I want to say it's about a B+ when it comes to ride. Not the most comfortable, but definitely quite comfortable. But again, Alex was able to test that CA-RAV, and he got it just under 140 feet, which means anywhere from 135 to 140 is just going to really be indicative of the fact that this is so heavy, and those tires, wide as they are trying really hard to do the absolute best they can. So coming to an absolute stop in an emergency situation is also not where this will shine. But I will say the regenerative braking that you get on this vehicle means you're not going to end up using your brakes a whole lot if that's the system you like to take advantage of. And it's one that I very much do. And the fact that we do get a regenerative brake paddle here on the steering wheel means that you can dial that in and out as you want. So even though I have it on high regenerative braking, one pedal driving, I also use that lever to provide more regenerative power, but also to help dial it in a little bit. Because before you start lifting off the throttle, if you pull that lever, every movement you make with your foot is going to be just that much more precise in how it communicates with the truck. And even though I wasn't towing, I can imagine that even when towing, you're still not going to have to use those brakes a whole lot, especially if your trailer has brakes. It'll go ahead and manage a lot of that on its own. What is going to come in a little bit lower on the ratings is going to be the handling, because not often do you get a great ride score and a great handling score, and in this case we're looking for more capability out of the vehicle than anything else, really. So the fact that this can tow 10,000 pounds, and even though I haven't done it here at home, I would do so pretty confidently. At no point would I feel like I'm going to get tossed around in this truck, but that sort of bulk, the confidence-inspiring size and weight and athleticism that you get does not always mean agile, and agile this truck is not. You can get into a corner, but I would go into the corner slower and push out harder, because that's going to be the best experience for you. If you come in too fast, it will feel too fast very quickly. And these tires, even though they are pretty wide at 275, are not going to be sports car experience. And there are going to be other electric trucks that do a better job of that. But those electric trucks don't offer quite the same experience this does. And I would say if you're out on an open road trip, then this is probably the one you want to lean to. If you like sportier driving, but you still need the practicality of a bed, this probably isn't it. And I would go maybe as high as a C, C minus when it comes to handling, but I don't think that's a bad thing. This is still a truck. It might be a little bit louder right now because of the rain, but overall, this is a pretty quiet cabin. And that insulated feeling is definitely felt here. In not a bad way, because I don't think most truck drivers want to go ahead and hear everything that's happening around them. That's a bit more of a sports car thing. But here, not only do we have a really quiet powertrain in those electric motors, but I just feel like this has done a really good job with its mass of keeping everything else outside when it can. And noise is one of those things you just don't want more of if you don't have to. If I have a lowest low point for this truck, it has to be in efficiency. But to be fair, it has been pretty cold, anywhere from mid to low 30s all the way up to about 50 degrees max, meaning this heater is working a little bit harder, even though I do tend to leave things at 68 degrees. But not only are we heating the cabin, but also the batteries. Still, all said and done, I average just under 2 miles per kilowatt hour, between about 1.7 and 1.8. And that's not a terribly impressive number, but it's also not the worst. I mean, even the sibling of this, the GMC Hummer, although maybe that's more of a cousin if the Sierra is the sibling, that's going to be quite a bit worse, but it is a bit of a different machine. Very different shape, very different tires. I digress. This is not going to be the most efficient out on the road, but it really doesn't have to be because of the amount of battery that you get. So if you're looking for the longest, easiest road trip, then you're going to be able to get it in this no matter how many electrons you burn doing so, because you're going to be able to go the farthest without charging. You're going to be able to charge up very, very quickly, and this battery is so large that if you have a 600-mile trip, that means one stop and you'll be able to charge from a lower state of charge, meaning faster charging while you're stopped. And then the only downside is that if you're plugged in, let's say wherever you're going has a level 2 charger, it may not ultimately charge it overnight because of how quick it is. But 12 hours on the charger got me about 40 or so odd percent at my house, and that's a standard 11.5. If you have something faster, then obviously it will go faster. But at 19.2 kilowatts, this will charge about the same miles per hour as my Tesla will at 11.5 kilowatts. And that's all down to efficiency. It takes more electricity to get where you're going. When it comes to pricing, the range is a lot bigger in 2025 than it was in 24, but that's because we no longer just have the RST. Instead, we're up to 3 trims, though 2 of them are still RST. The RST extended range, the max range, and then the LT extended range, which does end up dropping that price significantly, though at no point would I call this a particularly inexpensive vehicle. Though you'll notice it doesn't stand out as the most expensive or radically expensive when compared to a lot of the other electric trucks on the market, and that's because all of these tend to be quite expensive, except for the one outlier there on the bottom, and that's the F-150 Lightning. We'll go ahead and start on that comparison, but before we do that deeper dive, I'm actually going to start with the closest comparison to the Silverado EV, and that's its cousin, that's the Sierra EV. And between those two, there are so many different shared components and features that for me, it really comes down to, yes, slight difference in price, but which one matches your aesthetic? And for me, I'm going to go with the Sierra EV, and we'll move right along from there. Because the F-150 Lightning, I think, is going to be one of the least shopped against this Silverado EV because they fall into 2 very different categories. One is a dedicated electric truck that is embracing everything electric, and the other one is an F-150 that has been electrified, and not in a bad way, but it does still face limitations because it's not a total redesign. So while we do have lower pricing, we also have things like lower power, lower range,
lower overall capacity numbers, and that just means that the limitation here is how much trucking you can do with your F-150 Lightning. But I will say, for folks who do a lot of their around town driving, if this is your commuter and your family hauler, and you occasionally want to make a trip to something like the hardware store, load up on topsoil, you have a boat that you tow to and from the lake, but that's not very far away and you don't do it too often, the Lightning is not a bad way to get into an electric truck that'll serve your needs without it feeling like it's screaming about its electric nature. What I think some shoppers might have to decide is whether they want to go with an off-road truck or if they want to go with a street truck, because that's where the Silverado EV feels to me, is that street truck performance look, and that's certainly there for the RST. But on the other side of the equation, not only do you have the cousin, but you have the second or third cousin twice removed in the GMC lineup, and that's going to be that Hummer EV pickup, which is wildly expensive, and that's just to start. You can get a lot less expensive Silverado EV than you can a Hummer truck, but really it comes down to what sort of persona are you trying to carry with you. Both of them will have extreme performance, but one of them is going to have extreme range and the other is just going to have extreme inefficiency. But it has a much bigger cool factor, I think, for folks who are, inclined to that sort of thing. I have to admit, I love the look of the Hummer truck, but for day-to-day driving, your everyday practicality, and for someone who at any point wants to fly under the radar, that's just not going to be the choice for you. So probably the Silverado EV, and well, there's a reason the Silverado EV is going to sell more units than you'll find over there from that GMC sibling. But now let's talk about the one people are most likely to shop this against, and that's going to be the Rivian R1T. I say that not because these are the most similar, but because I think they're the most complete on the electric vehicles out there, or the electric trucks in this case. Where the Silverado is certainly going to have the advantage when it comes to driving range, the R1T is going to be the most athletic, most fun to drive version that you can get, although if you put them both in a straight line, they're going to be pretty competitive. The R1T is still going to top that Silverado, but where it's going to fall behind are things like capacity, like towing, and your range, but both of those feel like the most dedicated, from the ground up, purpose-built, but at the same time designed for a more general audience. And the Silverado EV is not saying I'm a conventional truck, and neither is the R1T, but the Rivian does seem to have its own funky nature to it that I know not everybody is on board with. And it doesn't have quite the same capability, especially when you consider functions like the Midgate. The R1T is, I think, the least practical truck on this list, minus the Cybertruck, but that's a different conversation. While the Silverado has basically the functionality of a conventional truck. It's not quite the F-150 Lightning when you go head to head and say this one is the truckiest of the trucks, again, conventional truck design, but it does still have a good usable bed, Chevy's multi-flex tailgate, it has that Midgate so you can make as much space basically as you can afford to lose passengers, and all of this combined with all the driving range and all the performance and the same sort of interior that you get from other Chevy models just feels like it's designed for the most mainstream, but the Rivian R1T really has sort of pulled its own weight and made its own niche. Between the two, it gets a little bit tough, but I would probably go with that Rivian, but I wouldn't go with that full quad motor, which is obviously something you can't get on the Silverado. You'll still get an all-wheel drive, but you'll have a few less motors as you do it. So who's out here looking for a Silverado EV, and should you be someone considering it? Well, if you're shopping for any truck out there and you don't intend to use it for the most dedicated truck purposes on the most frequent basis, I say go ahead and take a look. If you like a luxurious feel, driving EV, if you've never done it, provides a lot of that. Quiet interior, plenty of power, and again, that interior feels more like a conventional Chevrolet product than some of the other competitors do versus conventional vehicles. I do think it's nice to look at, but I also know that design is subjective, and I already mentioned I like the GMC equivalent just a little bit better, but it doesn't feel like you're losing anything when you go this direction. It just isn't going to feel like that conventional truck experience, not as far as the daily drive, because while it is pretty comfortable, it does still feel like you're hauling thousands and thousands and thousands of pounds all the time. Think of it like a loaded up truck, even though the truck just has you in it. And when you put passengers in it, you won't really notice a difference. And even when you put a small payload in it, it's going to feel pretty similar to what it already had. And boy, does this thing have power for days and days. It has an enormous battery. You do have the ability to use it as a backup battery for your home should you end up losing power. It has the ability to output quite a bit of power on its own. It has all the cool functions that you can imagine a new age vehicle really should. Some of the downsides are certainly going to be price. I know the looks aren't for everyone. You may not want to drive tons and tons of vehicle around to take your kids to and from school, but I think that's less of a concern these days than it used to. And if you're looking for a little bit more in conventional truck capability, things like some off-road chops, well, we don't have that at the moment, but that's coming for 2026. The 2025 model year, though, if that's not where you're leaning, should be a pretty good buy these days. Though unfortunately we have lost that federal tax credit, it doesn't mean there aren't still going to be some deals to find on a Silverado EV. Thank you all for watching. If you have any other thoughts, questions, comments, or concerns, you can leave those down in the comment section. Find us on our Facebook page, our multiple channels, EV Buyer's Guide and Auto Buyer's Guide. You can also find our Auto Buyer's Guide podcast here on YouTube, where about half of you seem to tune in, or where you listen to your favorite podcasts. Till next time, I'll see you down the road.